Fourth and Long, episode 8 of the 2019 Fantasy Podcast. What we're going to do this episode is the typical first half. We're going to talk about the usual, and then the second half, we're going to break down some highlights, some busts, and some surprises of the first half that has been in our league. So, going to be interesting to see who we both pick. But Randy, first half already, wow, hey?
Yeah, I know. Hey, it seems like the draft just started, but then I guess we look at the record and we both played 8 games, and yeah, it's crazy.
All right, well, without further ado, before we waste everybody's time, let's get right into it. I'm going to start off with the fantasy surprise of the week. For me, it was Latavius Murray from Man Bear Pig. 27 points, 102 rush yards with 1 touchdown, 55 receptions with another touchdown. That's his back-to-back 27-point fantasy point games. And the last 2 weeks are more than double his first 6 games for points. I think he's done a great job filling in with Kamara being gone, especially in that offense. With Breeze being gone too, it's kind of like, okay, where's our next safety blanket? So let's just give it to the running back. But Murray's kind of been under everybody's radar over the past little bit, and here he comes with a couple good weeks. So Jerry's got to be happy with that. And just a quick note here, that's the first time in his career, and he's been in the league for I think 5 years, 6 years, where he's had back-to-back 100-plus yard rush games. So he's not even known for having great rushing games, but that's the first time he's done it back-to-back. And Jerry, like I said, Jerry might have himself a running back he might want to plug in here. Now, mind you, Kamara's probably coming back soon, but it's a good opportunity and definitely surprised me for sure from a running back's perspective.
Yes, that's a very good candidate for it. Obviously, like you said, this is the guy that, didn't he fill in for Dalvin Cook when he was hurt last year in Minnesota? So, like you said, with his back-to-back 100-yard games, it's not like he's a bench warmer his whole career. He's been a starter before, and this is the first time he's done this. He's actually more surprising even than my pick. You managed to pick him first, so I'm going to stick with another running back for my surprise, and that's Miles Sanders, running back for Philadelphia, and obviously plays for the Devil Raiders. His 74 yards is the most of the year. He's a rookie, so it's the most of his career. This is his first rushing touchdown he got, which is always good fantasy-wise. The big part about the surprise is he scored 19.8 points versus his 5.3 3-point projection. So that's a big part of his surprise. He wasn't expected to do anything, and lo and behold, he just about reaches 20 points. So that was huge for Kelly. He had himself a good game, and Miles Sanders was a big part of that.
Yeah, I know for sure, and it's just interesting how they're kind of getting him involved a lot, especially with Howard. It seems to be a plug and play in that running back. Of course, you have a quarterback who can run as well, so when Sanders kind of gets the love that he does, you take it for when you can, absolutely. Well, let's just go backwards on this train. Randy, who's your, I'll just let you keep rolling here. Who was your bust of the previous week?
Well, my bust was the Chicago Bears defense.
Ooh, don't hear that often.
I know most of the time we don't expect much out of a defense. It's more of a surprise that they do well. But this had the potential. The Bears were playing the Chargers this week. This was the potential for an actual kind of a juicy matchup. Now, I know the Chargers have a few good skill players. Rivers is still a good quarterback. Melvin Gordon's back, and Eckler is good on third down and passing situations. But that Chargers O-line is pretty weak. Some might even call it a bit of a mess. And Keenan Allen is in, like, if you had read the rankings, which I'm sure you all did, he's in a good 5-week rut. He hasn't been doing well. Keenan Allen has. So there was a lot more potential for this matchup-wise, I believe. And of course, Yahoo agreed with me somewhat. They projected 8.95 points, which is pretty good for a defense. They usually don't go out on a limb and pick double digits for defenses. But all they he ended up getting was one sack and one turnover, which was an interception, and only 4 points total for fantasy points. And that's a big disappointment for me for a situation that could have been real big for Corey, and he didn't end up getting much out of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, the Chargers give up the 13 most points for the fantasy from the defensive perspective. And when you're talking about a highly touted defense such as the Bears, you think you could almost turn that 13th into about top 5, really, because your defense is that good. Thankfully, they only had 4 because I played Corey last week. Interesting bus pick there. I think you broke that down pretty good. That's an interesting perspective. For me, I'm just going to stick with Corey's team. I'm going to his running back position, Le'Veon Bell. 3.5 points, 23 rush yards, 12 receptions, 0 touchdowns. Remember, in the draft, Jerry had him last year, let him go to the Wolves, and Corey picked him up with an early draft pick, and I just don't see this panning out for Corey. I'm sure he'll have something to say about it. But had this running back really done anything, I believe Corey probably would have beat me or had the potential to really put a pressure on me. Reports were that I read this week, I don't know if everybody else did, but the Jets were actually thinking of trading him, but apparently they're not expected to now. He's only had 5 catches for 21 yards over the past 3 games, and Jacksonville was the 13th fewest to the running back, but I mean, Bell has really been a disappointment this year. He is definitely not the Pittsburgh version of Bell. That Jets O-line, I mean, you talk about the Chargers O-line, check out that Jets O-line. And he's only had 3 games over 10 points this year. And how many times do you see a running back projected over 10 points? It's almost like on the daily. So for only 3 games over 10 points, especially when, I'll make fun of myself here, Corey was playing a bottom feeder team, you think your running back could maybe secure you that easy win, but it didn't pan out for him.
And I don't know if you remember, we've been doing this podcast a couple of years now, not too long, but I don't think we've ever had both of us pick a bus from the same team. So we're really jumping on Corey this week. You know what? We calls them like we see them.
Yeah, ruse is ruse. But anyways, last thing before we go, because the second half might be a little bit more in depth here. Fantasy highlight for me, I think without a doubt, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit later, is Tevin Coleman from the 49ers for Clueless. 35.8 fantasy points, 105 rush, 3 touchdowns, 13 receptions, and another touchdown. So 4 touchdowns. And I mean, San Francisco put the boots to Carolina. That game was just not even close. And for a score to be that high, like you always mention, I think a lot, Randy, is when it gets run up there, they kind of just run the ball, but you don't expect the running back to continue to get points. Like just a couple just kill the clock plays, punt it away at that point. Now he scored 3 touchdowns in the first 30 minutes of that game. And he's playing in that committee system too, right? Which is interesting that he's come out on top. He's got a few other names in there. Unfortunately, Jake's probably looking at this going, shit. I let him go in the draft because he could have potentially had him as a keeper. But hey, people make decisions all the time here. But basically, he got half of his points in that week because he's only got 75 on the year. So monstrous week for Tevin Coleman, and he basically secured Allen the win, in my opinion, because if Coleman does what he's done for usual, or maybe just subpar, you would have won that matchup. So Tevin Coleman, highlight of the week.
Yeah, and definitely a great candidate for that. Kind of helped him out a bit. That I think Breda left the game early with an injury, a bit of a precautionary one, and obviously he ended up being fine because he played last night on Thursday night and played quite well. Obviously Coleman didn't have quite the day that he did last week, but hey, definitely a top candidate for that. My second candidate, I'm going to stick with him as well. We're gonna really shorten the bench as far as the teams we're picking from here. I'm going to go with Cooper Kupp, wide receiver for the Rams, also on Clueless. 220 yards and 1 receiving touchdown for 28 points. not too shabby itself. Um, the first 100-yard game in 3 weeks for Cooper Cup, which is a bit of a shock for some people, especially since he really got off to a real torch of a hot start here. But again, obviously Coleman wasn't good news because I was playing against him, but Allen did beat me by 28 points, and that's basically what Cup did. So, you do the math. That was a big reason why he beat me, especially with the good Thursday night game that I had with all my Vikings players. Didn't matter because these two guys that we just mentioned, they really lit it up and gave them the win.
Yeah, no, I know Allen's kind of made fun of me a couple times because I think he's tried to throw Cup in a couple trades, and I just said nah. And his stock has been rising, and I get the text message here or there saying, "Hey, interested in him now?" So I mean, good receiver, but it's interesting because last year on that team, he was hurt or concussed, and Cooks was the pony. Now it seems to be that when Cup's healthy, he's the go-to. So yeah, that's a good highlight. I was looking at Cup too because I think it's just one of those matchups where the Rams offensively just haven't been what they used to be. So I think when one of them breaks out, you kind of have to give a nod. And frankly, I'm kind of tired of talking about quarterbacks. So
Exactly.
yeah.
So yeah, that's wrapping up our last week stuff. We're gonna go a little bit. We're gonna kind of do a bit of the same stuff here, except as far as picking studs, busts, and surprises. But we're gonna go with our first half players. Now this is a bit different, just because we're going in multiple games. So obviously one bad game here or there doesn't affect it. But how about I start us off here with my first half stud? We'll talk off something big. I don't think this guy really needs to be thought of anymore. We've actually kind of don't mention him as a weekly stud because we're just kind of used to it. And this is Christian McCaffrey. I mean, really, like he's the highest scoring non-quarterback player in the league. That basically tells you all you need to know about why he's the first half stud. But it's not like he just had one or two big games. He has only 1 week where he had less than 15 points. That's pretty much as consistent as you can get, and that is also the only week that he didn't score a touchdown. Obviously, we know he does it on the ground, he does it in the air, he can do it either way. If you need to, if the running game gets shut down, he still gets your points in the air. He averages 105 yards rushing and 49 yards receiving a game. He has 10 touchdowns in 7 games, and like this kid, basically, you can pick him first overall. You can trade all kinds of draft picks for him. He's worth it on any team. This kid is he is the best fantasy player in the first half of the season, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, and it's fun to talk about fantasy, but when you even look at the NFL as a whole, at this pace, in my opinion, as a fan, it's very hard to ignore this guy for the MVP of the league. What he is doing on a team that doesn't even have a quarterback is remarkable. Like you just mentioned, his stats. So if you were to take the first half and double it, that would give him almost 1,500 yards and 20 touchdowns as a running back. This guy is an absolute workhorse, and Cody has to be just laughing at this because it's almost like he doesn't care about maybe a tight end position or the kicker or the defense because this guy's almost making it up for those two positions. So found himself a very nice keeper, and I agree with you. That's an interesting first half highlight. No, not interesting. It's pretty obvious, but for me, I just think I just have an unreal one. It's with the Devil Raiders. I think the first half highlight is the New England Patriots defense. This is an unreal year, not only in real statistics but fantasy as well. 5 players on this defense have multiple interceptions. They have 31 sacks, first in the league. 19 interceptions, first in the league. 6 touchdowns, first in the league. 2 block kicks, first in the league. 177 fantasy points, which is 65 more points than San Francisco, who, by the way, is also undefeated, and 100 more points than Carolina's defense, who is third. And, excuse me, they're 6th overall in fantasy points for all positions. They actually even have four more fantasy points than their quarterback Tom Brady, who currently has 173. And I can't remember when a fantasy defense has been this dominant, where they're averaging 22 points a game. I mean, this just keeps getting better for Kelly every week. Like, you think, well, they can't keep this up, and then they do. And lastly, they finished the last season with 145 fantasy points, and we're halfway through the season, and they have 177. So to me, first half, not even close, is the Pats defense.
And I love those defenses, and we've mentioned them more than a few times here on the podcast. Makes perfect sense to me that they would be up there. That's absolutely right, and like you said, they're heads and shoulders above any other defense in the league, which puts them at that much more an advantage fantasy wise.
Yeah, no. So, do you want to just? I'll just let you keep leading off every category. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay.
I'll go with my fantasy bust for the first half. You've already mentioned him in this podcast, so there'll be just a little bit added on here. This is Le'Veon Bell, and as you mentioned, a first-round pick of the Bears. Currently, he's the 28th ranked running back by fantasy points. That basically tells you where the rest of the talk on him is going to go. Also, something interesting, I was just looking back at the draft picks. Do you know who went right after Bell in the draft? I took Delvin Cook, the exact pick after Bell. So that's a good way to indicate how much a bust it was that Corey could have had Delvin Cook. Now, of course, a Bears fan would have to cheer for Vikings running back, which kind of makes you balk a little bit if you're a Bears fan. But anyways, back to Bell. In every year except for his rookie season, he has averaged 85 or more yards per game. That every year, his average per year per game is 85 yards plus. And in 2017, his last great year, his average was 86. In 2019, this year, his average is 50 rushing yards, and he only has one rushing touchdown. Basically, he would be a bust even if he wasn't a first-round pick this year. Even if he was a third-rounder, it would still be a bust because, even though we all had questions about what would he do with the Jets, obviously there were lots of people, not just Corey, but lots of people that thought that Bell would at least be good, but 50 yards a game for the first half of the season, that's not good. That's pretty down there. So that's why he's my bust.
Yeah, I mean, I just spoke a lot about it, so I'm not going to repeat too much. I just think, I think Corey, but you have to look at the value too. And okay, he sat out from Pittsburgh. He gets traded to or signs with the Jets in the off season. He's released in our league. Hopkins goes 1, Chubb goes 2. Hard not to take that type of running back, which he's capable of. It wasn't an injury, remember. That was just a holdout. So my question to you is, had he taken Cook, would you have taken Bell?
I'm trying to think of what my thought process was. It would probably depend on what other players were left on the board. I didn't know. I didn't look far enough into it to see if I would have picked. I didn't have Bell very high on my ranking. I know that much. I was just too afraid to do it. But at the same time, I already had Zeke Elliott as a keeper, so I may have picked him. But just because I figured Zeke would be anchored in my running back core, I wouldn't expected that much from him. Yeah. So whether that means I would take him with that next pick or later on, again, I'd have to go back and see what running backs were available. But I mentioned, it's not like people knew he was going to be a bust. There was just question mark.
Exactly. No. So, for me, my first half bust is Zach Ertz, tight end Philly, belongs to Man Bear Pig. 48 points on the year, 424 yards, 1 touchdown. He leads all tight ends with 153 receptions since the start of last year. However, all of that basically came last year. He's finished last year with 164 fantasy points, and even if he keeps pace right now, he'd be about half of what he did last year. And his big stat line, obviously, last year was 1,163 yards, and he's not even close to reaching that, in my opinion. He's only reached the 10 plus points once this year, was the game where he got the touchdown. To me, this is an absolute bust. This type of caliber of player, I know I've harped on the tight end position, but again, I think we can all agree in this league that there's basically was Gronk, Kelsey, and Ertz were in there. Kittle started to emerge last year. And it's just interesting that, I mean, I've tried to trade for Ertz for 7 weeks, and it's just not happening because Jerry also auto drafted George Kittle. But I'm sure I'm not the only one who's tried to get this guy because even though he hasn't performed, there is potential because of who he is and what he can do. But it's just disappointing to watch this guy not even come close to his potential. And I've mentioned this before, I think, in a bust episode. His red zone production, and not even production, his targets and how they're utilizing him is not even close to what they were last year. Like, his percentages are way down across the board. And I think Jerry, I'm not sure if he's even listening to this. Our trade deadline's coming up. I'm not sure if you're looking to move him. I'm sure other guys are probably looking at it, but I'm curious to see. I'm not sure what you're going to get from trade value wise from him now, what you would have had early on in the year, because there would have been so much of the season left. So I just feel for Jerry, especially auto drafting two tight ends in the first 2 rounds. I think anybody who had Ertz has got to be disappointed in what he's done in the first half of this season.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially and I'm just kind of thinking of, obviously, I don't know what Jerry's thinking for his strategy, but it's possible that he was hoping to flip Kittle and put Ertz in, but Ertz has been so disappointing, like you said. It's like, well, Jerry's obviously thinking, well, I can't get rid of Kittle and nobody wants Ertz anymore. He might end up being stuck with both of them. Or at the very least, flip Ertz for not very much. Unless he has 1 or 2 good games here, and kind of bring some people back up, I can't see any value for it at all. He has to keep Kittle now.
Yeah, I would agree. I think he has no choice, but it's just tough. I'm very shocked at the production slide. Like, if you look at what Ertz did last year compared to where he's at now, you can't tell me that's not a bust. And it's just amazing to me that that type of caliber player is being talked about like this. But it is what it is. That's my opinion. So.
Yeah. No one's going to change your opinion. We know that about you.
All right. Well, let's go to our one of our last categories here to recap the first half that was. So you're up.
So I'm going to go with my first half fantasy surprise, and we're going to stick in the tight end category as Austin Hooper.
Oh, okay.
The tight end for the Falcons, and you think, oh yeah, I remember that guy. I know he plays tight end. Well, did you know he's the highest scoring tight end in our league, in our fantasy league, with 20 points more than Kelsey, who is the next tight end? I talked about McCaffrey's consistency. Well, Hooper has 5 weeks of 10 plus points, and only 1 week with less than 5. And as we've talked about many, many times, the tight end position is basically a write-off nowadays. So anytime you can get more than 5 points as a tight end, you're happy. And if you get that every week, that's pretty solid. And the biggest reason why he's a surprise is because nobody, you just mentioned who the top 3 were expected to be in the Ertz talk. No one expected this guy in the top 5, maybe not even the top 10 tight ends, and here he is, number 1. And even had a great week last week, even with old Matt Schaub in there instead of Matt Ryan. So he can do it with any quarterback out there. And Matt Ryan should be back here right away, right after the bye week. He's the big surprise for me.
Yeah, interesting. I would have never guessed that's a name you were throw out here. I was just looking at some of the stats there on him. His receptions are 52 this year, and the most he's had in his career was last year. He played a full season with 71, so he's really being involved in that Atlanta offense. But I know he's on the radar. I've always looked for that guy's name, but somebody's always got him somewhere. But you just don't. When you look at him, you just don't say, I'm going to trade for that guy. You know what I mean? He's not like that household name, but he's quietly
Yeah.
creeping up the fantasy points. So, for
Mostly
surprise,
because the
yeah,
Falcons are losing a lot of games, so nobody's talking about them this year.
yeah. Well, it's always not what they do on the field. It's what like for their win loss. It's what that player can do for you fantasy wise. And to your point,
Mm-hmm.
he's definitely doing some fantasy. He's making noise in the fantasy world. So that's an interesting surprise. That caught me off guard too. I'm not sure if mine will catch you guys off guard, but for me, my first half surprise is Chris Goodwin from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who also belongs to Selby, and Shelley told me to. Um, I'd like to know if anybody out there saw this guy coming. He's averaging 15.5 points a game. That's the best of 68 qualified wide receivers, and the league average is 5.1 points a game. So he's basically tripling the league average. And it's not like he's got Brady, Breeze, or Rodgers. His quarterback is Jameis Winston, who is tied for first with 12 interceptions. So just keep that in mind. Last year, he finished with 126.2 points, and he's on pace basically to double that. And could, based on the remaining defensive matchups that actually Tampa Bay has. So look for Goodwin to continue what he has been doing here. Only twice this year he's been below his projections, but he's also doubled his projections 3 times this year. So even if he has a quiet week, he will definitely make that up to you. He's fifth in yards, 705, but he's tied for first with touchdowns. He's got 6 of them. The most touchdowns in his career was 7 in last year, and he's basically right now averaging 100 yards per game. And to me, on the team where Mike Evans is your go-to guy, this is a big surprise, especially with the quarterback factor that I mentioned, and is part of the reason why I think Selby is also doing quite well in this league. Is just getting a wide receiver that really probably a lot of guys didn't have on their draft board, and he's coming out to play this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we've talked about him being a stud. I think once or twice earlier in the season in one of his bigger games. But what surprised me more than anything was the consistency that you laid out for us here, and the fact that it's basically every week that he's being real solid, not always flying off the page, but like I said with Hooper and McCaffrey, the consistency is a big factor in a head-to-head fantasy league, and that is definitely a bit more of a surprise, especially when you think about preseason rankings and preseason predictions. He has definitely exceeded those.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, like I say, so it's I mean, if you do 100 yards a game, right? And he's got 6 touchdowns, so let's just even round it up to 7 just for simple math. That's basically 16, 17 points a game he's getting you.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's unreal. So good find for Selby, and he's got definitely some good value there. And I mean that's probably one of the reasons why he's currently sitting in third place. So that's kind of the first half wrap up there. So if your team didn't make the list or your players didn't, I'm sure there's some other good highlights, busts, surprises out there. Hey, write them down underneath the link to the video. Let us know who you think your first half highlight, bust, surprises are. I'd love to hear what you guys think. You're watching the same football we are. Unfortunately, you're watching how bad I'm doing, but you're watching the same football, so it'd be interesting to see what you guys think, and where we maybe missed out on a few names. But I think we got a few minutes here, Randy. Do you want to talk about a couple trades?
Sure, yeah. Let's talk about some. I mean, I don't think. Let me just go down to the trade and click it on here. Okay, yeah. So there's I guess. Yeah, I guess there's a couple trades. Where did we leave off? Did we leave off on
the Matt Stafford trade?
Matt Stafford. Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. So we got a Duke Johnson being sent to the Misfits for T.J. Hawkinson, global warming. kind of a minor trade here. I know that Ryan had offered Duke Johnson to me. I'm not going to talk too much about that trade or about that potential trade because I declined it. But Duke Johnson is basically playing second fiddle to Carlos Hyde in Houston, and Hawkinson had a great game early in the season and has not done much since. So it's kind of interesting that this is kind of like a secondary trade. I don't know if you have anything else to add on it.
No, I think it's just a positional value trade. I think Ryan was jammed up, ran out of ads, I think, and needed to include a tight end because Jared Cook's on the bye. So that's probably why he did that. Nigel, I
Yeah,
think, had.
I got some more to add later on about Ryan's bye week management this season. It's probably the worst I've seen in a long time. But anyway, we can talk about that later if we have time.
And I think, like you said, I think it's just a simple trade. And I mean, you got to make what's work. And there was no draft picks involved, so it's kind of harder to evaluate. It's probably just a straight up. So it is what it is. Then you were involved in a trade. How quickly you moved on from Stephon Diggs.
Yes, actually, funny thing is, I actually held on to him longer than I actually wanted to. I was considering flipping him right away, but Amari Cooper was on the bye with the Cowboys, so I said, well, why don't I keep Diggs until that bye is done? And then also Adam Thielen with the short playing week. The Vikings played on Thursday last week, and Thielen was out. I said, well, okay, yeah, I need to keep Diggs for one more week. So pretty much as soon as the Vikings played, basically, and I knew that the trade wouldn't mess up my lineup, I went ahead and offered him to Jake, to the old dirty bastards. I needed a tight end. I've talked before. Delaney Walker has done nothing for me since week one, and there's nothing on the waiver wire, as we talked about. It's a shallow position, and I saw Jake had two tight ends, and he could sure use a good wide receiver, and one fell on my lap a couple weeks before, so I just said, hey, why don't we make this trade? And I made sure to only ask for a draft pick that Jake got in another trade, so that he didn't feel like he was going to be giving up too much. I wanted to make sure that Jake felt that he was getting something maybe even more than Stephen Diggs, or wasn't giving up too much, because I really wanted this Andrews kid. I really wanted him at tight end, or anything better than Walker at least. So I wanted to make sure that this benefited him as well, so that the trade would get done.
Yeah, no, and I've tried to target that Andrews too. Just the pieces didn't fall into place. And if you look at Jake's roster, just things haven't unfortunately gone his way this year. So if you're already starting to potentially start raising that white flag and planning for next year, well, who do you like on your team that you want to keep? And I know Diggs isn't a top receiver, but he's done well enough to say, hey, yeah, you know what, I'll take that guy off Randy and potentially maybe keep him as a keeper next year. And I didn't have to give too much up from a draft pick. And I, like you mentioned, gave away one that I've acquired, so I'm not losing in the 8th round. So that was a good trade. I think that was a pretty even trade, in my opinion.
Yeah, I felt it was too. I mean, we both had something extra. I had an extra wide receiver. He had an extra tight end, and I didn't. I could have tried to offer him my lesser wide receiver, but he might not have taken it. So sometimes you got to give up something good. But you know what? My receiver core is still pretty darn good. I've got Thielen, who looks like he's healthy now. Cooper's back from the bye. I don't have any problems with wide receiver. I got no problem giving up Diggs.
Well, I know there's a couple more in the queue, but we'll talk about those next episode to give us something to finish on. It's always nice that basically we've had trades to talk about every episode. So again, deadline's coming up soon. We'll be posting that in the Facebook page. But that kind of concludes last week's quick recap, and then of course a recap of who we thought were the best, the medium, and the worst of the first half of our season. A few weeks to go. Week 13 will be our last regular season week, and week 14 those playoffs start, which of course gives us more to talk about for different ideas for a podcast. So good luck this weekend in all your matchups. There's going to be some good ones, I think. There's some interesting scenarios that happened on Thursday that created either gaps up or down. So it's going to be interesting. So good luck this weekend, guys, and we'll talk to you next week.
Sounds good, guys. We'll see you later.